Hello, everyone, and welcome back to your MSF private podcast feed. I am your host, Michael Stephen Fuchs. So, as threatened last time, here's a little more about the writer's journey, or mine anyway, and mainly an unfortunately totally unavoidable part of that journey, namely the dark nights of the soul that every serious writer ends up having to endure and find a way to survive. So, today I'm going to share with you the story of the three biggest and darkest dark nights of the soul that I personally had to battle my way through on the way to finishing what is, we're pretty sure, the world's only special operations military zombie apocalypse epic, which, as we know, is called ARISEN. So last time I described the genesis of the series and the process of writing the first couple of books. Beyond that, things were going pretty gangbusters for the first 3 or 4 titles. My co-author and I were honestly having a blast writing them. Over-the-top military action and mayhem and good old zombie killing fun. And we were finding a really fantastic audience, namely you guys, who really dug what we were doing and were pushing each book higher up the bestseller charts on Amazon. Now, in fairness, each book was definitely getting harder than the last one. I was very conscious that I was trying harder things each time, and the series was very much growing in scope and complexity. Never mind drama, action, explosiveness, and emotion. And then came ARISEN Book 5, Exodus. Up till then, this was definitely the magnum opus of the series, and the explosive climax of the first act of the whole epic. If you're not familiar, if you haven't gotten that far, it centers on a rampaging herd of 10 million undead, the largest ever recorded, bashing into a beached and stranded nuclear supercarrier, and its frantic and desperate defense by the living, including 2 teams of elite special operators who, after somehow completing the suicide mission into undead North America, had to parachute down onto the flight deck and essentially join the defense of the Alamo, the ship's 5-acre flight deck becoming the scene of a furious and desperate set-piece battle, and one complex almost beyond describing. And so then it turned out this was the ARISEN book that nearly beat me. Like all well-structured stories, this epic project had an all-is-lost moment, followed closely by a dark night of the soul. And in that dark night, I genuinely thought this book was too big, too hard, too complex, too daunting, and that my powers to make it happen were inadequate to the job. I had seriously lost faith that I could make this story work. Every chapter I wrote looked horrifying, and every new one I had yet to write looked impossible. I told my co-author I thought I was going to have to put the whole thing aside and just work on something else for a while to try to clear my head. He wondered aloud if we might be zombied out and perhaps should wind up the series more quickly than we'd intended. For my part, I seriously wondered if we'd simply built a story both too intricate and too sprawling to manage anymore. But somehow, over the next 24 hours, instead of walking away from it, I made a decision. I decided that ARISEN was, by far, the best story I had to tell. And much more importantly, I decided I was going to write this book if I had to do it 5 words at a time. That is, even if the magic never came back and the whole thing remained a complete soul-crushing struggle fought inch by inch. But somehow, as soon as I had made that commitment, the magic came back. All those myriad interlocking plot elements started to slot into place. The story problems all became tractable, or even started to look like opportunities, and the writing became fun and thrilling again. Okay, in fairness, there were actually about 100 subsequent occasions when it got hard as hell again, and completing the climax made me physically ill and wretchedly exhausted. But that's not important. The main thing is, it never again seemed fatally impossible. In retrospect, I think it was necessary that I pass through this crucible-type stage of the writer's journey. But to get there, I had to embrace, in my weak and tiny way, the one quality that all military special operators have burnt into their souls, namely resolve. I had to be committed to achieving the mission, no matter what I had to do, no matter what it cost me. Or, as perfectly described by a former Navy SEAL and sniper instructor as the only answer to adversity, and I quote, tough, deal with it, adapt and overcome. And what I found is, with those 7 words, you almost can't lose at life. There's no question in my mind that each of the books in the series has been harder to write than the last, but I'm equally sure that each one has turned out bigger, better, and more thrilling than those that came before. And long may that last. That's what I thought at the time, anyway. Now, fast forward 2 years and 5 more books. Yeah, I was writing a lot. And to the experience of writing books 11 and 12, the penultimate writing cycle, the last books in the series but 2, which made me realize powerfully that back when I'd called writing book 5 The Dark Night of the Soul of the project, I'd had absolutely no freaking idea. Okay, toward the beginning of that year and the beginning of that writing cycle, I more or less blew up my life, leaving a relationship of almost 9 years with the most wonderful gal I knew, leaving the city and neighborhood I'd lived in for 12 years, and jetting off to the south coast of Spain to find myself, or some damn thing. I even ran off with a woman literally half my age, playing out this ridiculous middle-aged man stereotype. Even as I did it, I knew this was a huge and stupid risk. Here I was within grasping distance of the conclusion of a startlingly successful series of books, with me actually finally making it as a working fiction writer after all these damned years. And all this unlikely success had been built on a bulletproof routine. My safe home space, my unbelievably supportive and motivating girlfriend, my well-worn running trails in London's royal parks, where I kept my head straight and generated all the story ideas, the perfectly tended writing space where I bashed them out into prose every day. So what did I do in the home stretch? I changed all of it overnight. And it turned out even worse than I'd feared. I was crushed with grief and guilt over the end of the relationship, disoriented by the complete change of surroundings and people, which felt like exile. My head was all over the place. It quickly started to look like I depended on my routine even more than I knew. Despite the beautiful surroundings I was in, despite the amazing people I met on the trail, every day became a huge emotional struggle just to stay afloat, and an even bigger struggle to write. As I got close to the end of book 11, I looked back at what I'd written and decided it had all gone horribly wrong. The book was a wreck, and it was all my own stupid fault. I'd had everything anyone could ask for, but it wasn't enough, and so I'd pissed it all away. But a funny thing happened on the way to the forum, or rather a funny thing happens every time I write a book. Somewhere between about the 85% mark and just after finishing, I become absolutely convinced the book is a disaster, though it's well known that every writer is insane on the topic of just completed work. In this case, and in every case, I truly believe that the book is not only terrible, but irretrievably so, unfixable, and that I've lost whatever talent I had, that I failed, that I'm finally blowing it. But the really weird thing is that not only does this happen every time, but every time I also somehow develop total amnesia about it. So, 2 or 3 times a year, the wonderful gal would come home from work and find me lying on the floor, and she'd say, "What's wrong, baby?" And I'd sputter, "The book's a total disaster." And she'd check her watch and go, "Ah, so it's that stage already, is it?" And I'd look totally baffled and say, "What do you mean?" And she'd say, "You can't possibly not remember that you go through this every time." But I don't remember. Maybe it's like childbirth. If you remembered how painful it was, you'd never do it again. But anyway, this time around, with no wonderful gal to pull me back, and moreover, having changed everything in my life overnight, I became convinced not just that the book was broken, but that the writer was. I was sure I'd never produce any decent material ever again, and soon after that the money would run out, and then I would literally be out on the street, a failure, broken, homeless, and totally alone. It was all over. I was screwed, and I'd done it to myself. Talk about a dark night of the soul. Like I said, the earlier episode had been nothing. So, what did I do? Well, what could I do? Nothing but follow the lesson of the special operators once again, or try to. I just had to dig down and find a way through, somehow. At first, I just spent a good couple of days drinking and crying. Seriously, just drinking and crying. And I can at least be proud of the huge boost I gave to Jack Daniels and Diet Coke sales in Andalusia. Then I spent a couple of days trying to pull it together. I said to myself, okay, I have absolutely no idea how to fix this. I only know that I have to, because if I don't, I'm dead, pretty much literally. And then after that, I spent a couple of days going back and forth, forcing myself to look at the material so far, trying to figure out what the problems actually were. And guess what? Eventually, they started to look manageable. I began to figure it out, and I screwed my head back on straight 1/64th of a twist at a time. I battled my way back. Anyway, if it's true that art requires suffering, then those 2 books should be very good indeed, and readers did love them. At the time, they were definitely the best-selling and most glowingly reviewed. Anyway, I don't think anyone can ever say I didn't bleed for them. I will add only that the climax of those 2 books, roughly the last quarter of the second one, Book 12, Carnage, was, by a very comfortable margin, the most complex, difficult, and ambitious material I'd ever tried to execute. Let me stress, at that time. That it seemed to work in the end is still a matter of fairly major amazement to me. As always, of course, you guys, the readers, will be the final judge, which is how it ought to be. And in retrospect, given what I went through, I think the titles of those two books, namely Deathmatch and Carnage, were by no means a coincidence. But having survived that crucible, of course I wasn't done, because the damn series wasn't done. The epic story wasn't complete. The world still had to be either saved or lost forever. Our huge cast of pipe-hitting, ass-kicking, but totally human heroes either had to prevail or else had to go down fighting, losing their battle and their lives forever. But I was trying not to think about that too much. Instead, I took a little bit of a break, going for a big trek up in the Himalayas in the Everest region of Nepal. And up there in those glorious, beautiful, desolate, high elevations, I had an epiphany. Not quite incidentally, this was on the best day of my life, the ascent of the third high pass of the trek, which is known as Kongma La, and the descent into the Imja River Valley, which is, by far, the most beautiful place I've ever seen. When our guide and my great friend Akash asked why it was the best day of my life, I told him it was because it was the hardest and most beautiful, and it was. And it turned out it was also a pretty good moment for ARISEN. Because prior to that moment, I had honestly been thinking, particularly with how devastatingly hard books 11 and 12 had been, that I could kind of just wrap up, and that having pulled off those prior to successfully, the whole thing was mine to lose. But no. The reality was I had to prove it again and take it up multiple notches every time out. Here's the exact text of the little note I scribbled to myself in my badly frayed and frozen notebook. And I quote, 13 and 14, I can't phone this in. It's got to be huge, and it's going to take all year. Every surviving character has to arc. The action and peril have to equal, or rather exceed, what's come before. People have to die. I have to work seriously and steadily and for a long time on story design. It's going to hurt. I've got to finish it right. And so it proved, but it also proved much harder than I remotely imagined, and it took more out of me than I imagined it would. In fact, it proved to be the hardest thing I've ever done or ever will do. I know I'll never do that again because it literally nearly killed me, and there's no way I'm putting myself through that again. In a word, after 6 months of intensive story design work, really after 6 years, 14 books, and 1.25 million words building up to it, I sat down and wrote nearly 1/3 of a million words in about 100 days. Because I am a moron and a masochist, but I guess we knew that. This was the climax and conclusion of the entire ARISEN epic. I honestly didn't think I'd get to the end of it. To try to create the focus, the focus that became clear I needed to do work of that quality and complexity, I basically put myself in isolation for the last couple of months, doing virtually nothing but eat, sleep, run, and write 7 days a week. And I even stopped running by the end. I was out of energy for it. Having anything in the calendar started to feel unbelievably stressful, so I just took out everything that wasn't writing. The price you pay for this, I found, is that isolation is where all the doubts really smack you in the face and the demons come out to cavort. So, in addition to doing what was by a comfortable margin the hardest work of my life, I didn't think the material could get any more challenging than books in 11 and 12, which shows what I know. I found I was having to fight sort of a parallel spiritual battle alongside it. But I guess that's nothing new either. As we know, the writer's journey is the hero's journey. It has to be. Because if the writer doesn't fight through hell to the life that lies beyond, then the hero's attempts to do so will ring false, and the reader won't be transported there either. We're all on the same journey, which I think they call life. Let me just briefly pause here to stress I know I don't have any kind of hard, never mind important job, like, say, any military personnel whatsoever, or law enforcement, or emergency services, or nurses, so many of whom are readers and fans of ARISEN. Those guys, you guys, are the actual heroes with 100 times the justification in complaining about the toll your work takes on you. Still, in this final phase, there were many, many moments when I stared at the hundreds of scenes I still had left to execute and doubted terribly that I would be able to pull this off. I honestly didn't believe my strength, my talent, my resolve were equal to the task I had set for myself. A moment came at the end when, months past exhaustion, I suddenly realized the ending didn't work, the whole ending of the entire series. And if the ending doesn't work, the story doesn't work. So I had to crawl back to the story design drawing board and re-architect the whole climax from scratch. That was another true dark night of the soul, let me tell you. But as always, I didn't have to feel like it. I just had to do it. and somehow I did. The great David Mamet, probably the best playwright of his generation, has said, and this is a quote, and they doubted themselves, and they all wanted to quit. Every hero, every heroine wants to quit, wants to give it up and say, I've had enough, I'm not equal to the task. Right, but nonetheless, they found strength somewhere, and they achieved a result which elevated them to the status of a god, or killed them. But I somehow got to the end, plus survived. And just between you and me, I'm pretty sure I pulled it off, that I nailed it, wrote something that lived up to and even exceeded everything that came before, that wrapped up everything in the series, every character journey, every story thread, exactly as it should be, and that blew the doors off in the process. Of course, you, the readers, will always be the final judge of that, and they have weighed in. Both the last two books in the series maintained a 4.9 out of 5-star average for years. Normally, I hate any just completed book, so the fact that I loved this one, or rather these two, right out of the gates, seemed like either a really good sign or else a really bad one. Then again, I also rather did like book 12 when I got done with that, and all of the readers strongly agreed that was the best one in the series so far. So now I think all that was happening was that I was finally, fumblingly, starting to meet my own standards for myself and for the work. The great Stephen Pressfield, an amazing writer of military fiction and chronicler of the writer's journey, has said, quote, bottom line, this struggle is as it should be. Our muse has put us here, in this place, fighting this fight, for reasons that we are blind to at the moment, but that are essential to our hero's journey, not just in the story, but in our lives. It's funny, but I asked myself along the way what kept me going, and decided I was pretty sure it was two things. One, my obligation to the characters. I can't let those guys down. And two, more predictably, my obligation to you guys, the readers. As I said many times, you're the best and loveliest and most switched on and supportive group of fans any author could remotely hope for. And I definitely can't let you guys down. And hey, I also beat George R.R. Martin. In the time, I banged out the entire ARISEN main series in just the time he was working on his next one, which still hasn't appeared. And also, ARISEN is longer than A Song of Ice and Fire, a lot longer at this point. So you're welcome. I never left you hanging. If you're new to the series, all I can say is thank you for joining me and all the other readers and characters on this unforgettable adventure. And get ready for a serious ride all the way to the end of the line.